Is capitalism destroying mental health? Now, this is a talk based on a book called Sedated, How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis, by a guy called James Davies. Oh, let's see if we can do this. So James Davies, he's an author. He's written about 4 books, 2 of them on psychiatry. Now, as the talk I did before, when I say psychiatry, I mean everything to do with mental health. That includes drugs and talking therapies and everything, not just drugs. He's got a PhD from Oxford. He's a researcher, lecturer and psychotherapist, and he's worked for the NHS and for Mind. So he's a pretty credible guy. So we're going to go through his main argument, the history, or the history according to him at least, criticisms of his argument, and a synthesis or my ideas. Okay? So essentially his main argument is that neoliberal capitalism favours productivity over well-being. So when he says neoliberal capitalism, what he's talking about is the capitalism of the 1980s onwards. So I'm not an economist, but from what he explains and what I understand, before the 80s, the capitalist model we had, if you like, there was a lot more sort of government regulation. And then there was a move to make it more market-led, so to deregulate it, privatisation, all that sort of thing. The aim was more growth, more profit, but he argues that's been at the expense of the well-being of people. So it's like market over people kind of thing. The mental health crisis is a social and structural problem. So basically he talks about how insecurity and distress is baked into this neo-capitalist system, if you like, because it's so focused, like I said, because it's so focused on the growth and the efficiency, it makes people stressed. And the other thing is that the mental health industry itself, he argues, actually just helps us tolerate the bad conditions. So rather than actually help people recover and get better, it's about a sticking plaster here, have some drugs, have some therapy, and get back to work. Okay? Everybody with me? Yeah. Cool. Right, so his argument about how we got here. So he says in the 80s, they had this like pro-market agenda, basically. He interviews Nigel Lawson, who I think was a politician. A Thatcherite, yeah, right. Nigel talks about how Thatcher's aim was to like transform the heart and souls of the nation. Basically moving from state reliance to more individuality and individual responsibility, which you could say is a good thing. But in doing that, it also moved, he argues, the responsibility of everything onto the person. So if the market's not going so well, it's rather than looking at, hey, what's wrong here? We go, why aren't you doing your bit properly? Mm-hmm. He also talks about debt culture. So when finance was deregulated in the 80s, it became easier to get credit. Now, I didn't know this, but apparently it was kind of more of a taboo to have credit in the UK, at least, whereas now, then it became more okay. And apparently that was because as things became more market-led, inequality grew, so people had to spend more to keep up with the Joneses. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, debt in itself causes psychological burden. Drugs and diagnoses. So he argues that drugs fit the neo-capitalist model really well, because if you've got a problem, it's like, hey, just take this thing and then you get better. So then that's that profit in there. It's something that's like, just take it. But also diagnoses changed. So back in the, I think the 70s, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, basically the diagnosis book that people use, that had about 100 disorders. And now it's got something like 370 odd. So he argues that kind of scope creep, it's actually really good for neoliberalism, because you can prescribe more things. You can there's more scope to prescribe, basically. There's all sorts of other things that I don't think I've got time to talk about fully, but basically, when you get a drugs approved, you need to do clinical trials. So you need to do a lot of research and stuff up front to prove it's not going to kill people. Okay, in the 60s, after the thalidomide scandal, if you remember that, they regulated it a lot because they were worried. And then it got slowly more and more deregulated. He argues, I think in the 70s, it's because of profit. And in the 80s, because of the AIDS crisis, because people were going, you need to speed this up. So they sort of decapped it and then never recapped it. Also, there's some scary stuff like with approval of drugs, like you only need 2 positive clinical trials, but they don't have to publish all of them. So they can do 10 trials, 8 can be rubbish, and then they can just use those two. Yeah, also, so this other thing, if a drug is this good, let's say in terms of treating depression, and the baseline is here, if they research a drug and they say, well, it's this good, if that's still statistically meaningful in terms of how good it is, they will approve that. They won't go, but it's not as good as this one. So again, the argument is this is more about profit and things than it is about actually helping people. And then also we've moved massively from a service sector from manufacturing. So manufacturing, I think, used to be like 40% of the UK economy in the 70s, and now it's about 10%. Services have gone up to about 80% of the economy now. And the argument is, if you think about when you're manufacturing, the product is the product, right? The people making it, arguably, not so important. But when it's customer service, you are the product, or the person there that they have to be on. And there's a lot of emotional labor there, which then means like that can add to stress and overwhelm and all that stuff. So that's his argument for how we got here. So his key points are, let me just check my notes. So like I said, modern work creates distress. He says that it's basically baked in. You've got stuff like long hours, fast pace, lots of admin, constant connection, 0-hour contracts. Again, the aim is output and efficiency, growth and stuff, and that's at the expense of the person. So he argues, like, environmentally, we're creating a system which makes people stressed and miserable. Okay. And he also talks about unemployment as a personal failure now. Apparently, years ago, like post-war, unemployment was seen as like an industry problem and it's something the government should help out with. And now it seemed like a personal failure. It's like, if you can't get a job, it's your fault. You're not trying hard enough, not because there's no bloody jobs. He also talks about this thing called new managerialism, which is basically like having targets and metrics for everything, which you could say is a good thing, but he argues the problem is that gets used to screw people like for output and then makes them miserable. He actually uses a case study from 2018 where this professor killed himself from Cardiff University because he was too stressed. And the academics came out afterwards and said, well, yeah, it's because of this culture you've created. And they criticised the mental health programs, and he goes into a lot of this in the book. Maybe you've seen it at work where it's like, hey, we've got this mental health initiative or this course. He says a lot of that stick and plaster stuff. And actually, again, it focuses on putting responsibility back on the person, mindfulness, resilience, stuff like that, not changing the bloody workload. Distress is pathologized, medicalized, and individualized. So again, like I said, he argues that we put a lot of pressure on the person, but also that we've now turned distress. If someone's having a bad time of it, it's not, maybe they're going through a divorce, or maybe because they've moved house or something. Maybe it's because work is busy. It's, you've got a mental problem, and therefore you need to fix that so you can show up and be better. And when you talk to people about getting a diagnosis, it seems to be a thing now. People are like, oh, I feel so much better, I've got a diagnosis. But he argues that research actually shows, even though people get that initial relief, arguably because it takes the kind of blame off them, it makes them worse in the long term because they're more likely to stay kind of stuck in that identity. They're not going to, why try and improve and change things if that's who you are. But also people treat them differently. And the way I think about it, it's almost like we say, don't worry, it's not your fault, you're just a bit broken.
That's a t-shirt.
Yeah. He talks about how current solutions are misguided. So again, like drugs, therapy and programs, I've touched on this a bit, but he argues that it's all about getting people back to work rather than it is about looking at the actual social issues and problems. What else? Yeah, so he talks about the commoditization of suffering as well. So so we talked about suffering being pathologized. So it's like, if you're having a bad time of it, there must be something wrong with you. But then, fitting the neoliberal model, we go, and that means you need to buy this thing to be better, which makes sense to me, because if you think about like the diet industry, the fashion industry, it's the same thing. If you want to see how this stuff works, anyone seen Mad Men?
Yeah, brilliant.
Right, watch Mad Men, because that shows you about how like this kind of thing, the advertising industry created this whole thing, this idea about identity-based, oh, you're feeling terrible, there's something about you, comparison or whatever, now you feel inadequate, we've got the solution. And he's saying we're doing that with drugs and mental health here. And again, he argues that mental health is a social problem rather than a biological problem. So a lot of research shows that things like, he says, flipping through his notes, realizing that he's got confused. 1 second. A lot of research shows that distress correlates strongly with poverty, income inequality, job insecurity, all of those social things. Very little research actually shows that there's a biological basis for most mental disorders, yet we still give people drugs and things like that. He actually argues that's a human rights issue because, you know, we're saying, hey, do this thing, even though this is the thing that'll actually solve it.
It's not addressing the root causes, is
Exactly.
it? And that's always.
That's his argument is basically, if you like, he doesn't say this, but it's like, it's institutional gaslighting, right? We're being told the problem's us, but actually the problem's the system, which sounds a bit conspiratorial, but that's basically his argument.
And then give yourself what.
Right, some criticisms of him. I'll try and whip through these because I'm conscious of time. His argument does sound a bit conspiratorial when you listen to it, but the more, you know, I listen to the evidence, I'm like, actually, he's got quite a compelling story. I think there's some truth in it, even if it does sound a little bit tinfoil hatty. He doesn't necessarily consider all the other social factors. So he doesn't talk really about trauma. He doesn't talk about technology, you know, 24/7 connectivity. You could say that's driving it. Social media, comparison, and sucking our attention. He doesn't necessarily mention that as a possible driver, although you could say that could be, you know, all part of neoliberal capitalism, I guess. One argument is that reform of the social issues is not exactly a quick fix, and that's why people haven't tackled it. It's all great saying like it's going to be a complicated social reform, but if he doesn't give a how-to, so what do governments do with that? Arguably, work in itself is not bad. So he kind of bangs on about modern work being the problem. Well, we used to send kids down coal mines. We don't do that anymore. So is modern work itself uniquely bad, or is it just, you know, a new kind of bad? Exactly. So diagnosis, drugs and therapy aren't all bad. So again, like some people, they do find real benefit from diagnosis. And arguably the reason we label things is so that we know what to do with them. In therapy, they teach people what emotions are and what emotions they're feeling, so then they know how to deal with it. Drugs do help people. I've been quite open. I've been on SSRIs for a few years and they really helped me get through a bad time, and they help me live in the world that we live in. I'd ideally not like to be on them, but here we are. And he bangs on about cognitive behavioural therapy being a bad thing, but arguably it's the government structure, the government version of it that's the problem. A CBT purist, for example, who's doing private therapy, they may be doing a very different version of it. Personal responsibility, I still think, is really important. So what was my point on that? Yeah, some people do just have some unhelpful habits and ideas about themselves and the world. And I think I think it's a good thing to remember that, you know, if you've got someone, if they stay up all night, binge watching Netflix, and then their attention shot the next morning, the problem might not be their workload when they can't do it the next day. And correlation is not causation. So basically do you guys know the difference between correlation and causation? Okay, well, so a lot of the evidence that he uses is correlational. It's not causational. So it's not experimental. The thing with correlation is that you're saying like, if this goes up, this goes down, or we see if this goes up, this goes up. But that's just showing that they are somehow connected, but not why. You could have a reverse cause. So it could be when that goes up. So if equality goes up, mental health goes down, but it could be actually mental health goes down first and then equality goes up. But it could also be that those two things are affected, but there's other factors making that happen. And that's not always clear. So those are his criticisms. Now the synthesis, so conclusion. In my experience, a lot of what Davies is saying, I think is correct. So the organisation that I work for now, it's a charity, they're brilliant. They really look after their people. There's a real community feel. You can tell that just, there's a lot of things, even like the office banter, the fact that it's safe to have office banter. They really look after their people. The first company I ever worked for was similar to that. It was a limited company. And people used to say, even for interviews, they come around and go like, it's just the people here. There's something about the people. But slowly over time, that company got sold and it floated on the stock market, got bought and bought and bought. Eventually it was run by Americans who just did the standard neoliberal thing. And it was all about the profits and the target, and everybody became miserable and stressed. The whole thing was run on stress and anxiety. And so I watched that kind of, what he's talking about happen like to the same place in real time. Didn't see it, know it at the time, but I watched it happen. And that leads on to, I've talked about this before, the biopsychosocial model of health and illness. I wanted to stopwatch, but that's fine. I'm going to run over. Sorry, Steve. Where was I? Biopsychosocial model. So biopsychosocial model, okay, that basically says we're a product of our environment. Okay, there's a symbiotic relationship. We affect the environment, it affects us. That really fits what Davies is talking about, right? If you've got a few people with mental health problems or they're scattered around, you could say maybe that's an individual problem. If there's a mental health crisis that extends across like lots of age ranges and industries and stuff, there might be an environmental structural problem. At the same time though, like I was saying, I think we need to be aware of that perception filters reality through experience and belief. So this is the personal thing, right? What we experience goes through our stuff. We don't experience it in objective reality. And that's why I've got this picture here of this guy. He's seeing these ewes on the corner, looking hooded and scary, and he's terrified. And his daughter's walking with this, like saying, "Daddy, can I go play with them?" With this, this thought bubble of playing with the kids. Now the question is she being naive because she doesn't know what they're like, or is he being overprotective because he's got some negative beliefs because he's been watching too much news? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And for me, these are we need to consider both of these. We need to consider the biopsychosocial model, the fact that we're a product of our environment, and we need to consider that we have our own filters going on. That's it. Any questions? So when I first listened to the book, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. It sounds like they're doing this on purpose. Yeah. I think it's more likely just ignorance. It is. I think when people sign up for these programs, they think that's the problem because they think the problem is the individual. I don't think they're thinking, hang on a minute, this is the whole structure that's causing it.
Yeah, they're not macro enough.
Exactly.
I don't disagree with anything that he said, but the really scary thing that came out of it is there's no easy solution, is there?
No, well, for example, the thing with drugs, right, is if you say, okay, you've got depression or you've got anxiety, that's great. Do you want these drugs? Or we can go 12 sessions of CBT and then you'll get back to work, because that's what we've been told. But actually, in actuality, proper therapy, for example, takes a lot longer. You need to build a relationship with people. And that's not just somebody you get given as a therapist, but even social reform, social care, stuff like that. I mean, like if you go talk, I know they talked about making a 4-day working week before, but like stuff like that, like where do you start? I think that's the issue.
David, as usual, fantastic.
Yeah, really good.
Love your
Thank you.
presentation.
Yeah, really good.
Thanks, guys.
Very good.
I always look
Thank you.
Thank you.